Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with our global multi-stakeholder community, representing national and local governments, international policymakers, civil society, NGOs, the ICT industry, as well as other relevant organizations and institutes.
I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and foremost privileged to have a conversation with Professor Guy Berger. Guy, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Yeah. For those of you who do not know who Guy is, he is a director at UNESCO in Paris, the director of the Freedom of Expression and Media Development. He's also been named a global voice of press freedom. And as a professor in journalism and media studies in Rhode Island in South Africa, that's your background, South Africa. And if I may, the topic is going to be accountability in the digital media. But if I may, I very much would like to start, it's a long time ago, with your personal background, what you experienced as a young activist journalist.
Sure. Actually, before I joined UNESCO 10 years ago, I was a professor and head of a journalism school at Rhodes University. Not quite Rhodes Island, but Rhodes University.
Sorry, no, my bad.
And there I was a professor there for about 15 years. And I was previously a student there. And under the apartheid system, I became an activist, and as a result, unfortunately, I was arrested and sent to jail for two and a half years. So this really influenced me because I was put in prison because I was possessing banned books. In those days, of course, there was not digital media, it was all hard copy media, and I happened to have Mandela's No Easy Walk to Freedom. As well as some other publications. And this was enough to get me sent to prison. At any rate, I was pleased ultimately to be part of a democracy and where there's strong press freedom. When I was at the university as the head of this journalism school, having worked prior to that as a journalist and as an editor, I became very interested in the mid-1990s about the rise of the internet and what it meant for media, what it meant for journalism. And of course, in the beginning, it was really a question of how can journalists use the internet to improve their reporting? In other words, their gathering of information. How could they use email, databases, and then ultimately, how could they publish on websites? So it was really Web 1.1. And I think it's safe to say, without blowing my trumpet, that I was quite forward-looking in those days. And together with a colleague, we started a new media laboratory at the university. And we also convened a conference called the Highway Africa. Highway Africa, it still continues. It's now something like 23 years old. And Highway Africa it became the biggest meeting of African journalists on the continent. Each year, there would be up to 400, 500 African journalists talking about new technology and how it intersects with the press freedom, media development, and the other challenges facing communications in Africa. And then 10 years ago, I joined UNESCO. As you said, I was director, I have been director for Freedom of Expression and Media Development. More recently, my title changed to focus on strategies and policies for the whole of the work that UNESCO does in this field. So it includes access to information, heritage, digital skills, part of UNESCO's work in artificial intelligence and so on, but at a strategic level and at a policy level.
Okay, well, definitely the right person to talk to at the moment. Now, before we go into the issues today, I just want to take you back a little bit, like 10, 15 years ago. And you actually mentioned that as well, that once the internet was introduced and you saw what was happening, you had this sense of, oh, this is actually going to help with bringing more freedom, more democracy in the world. The Arabic Spring is an example of what we experienced. Unfortunately, we saw it actually backfired. It did not deliver what we hoped it would do. So my question to you is, if you look at journalism, the fact that we now have this digital component, has it helped freedom of expression, or has it actually been detrimental?
Mm-hmm. So bear with me and I'll give you a perspective that has evolved while I've been at UNESCO. Freedom of expression, we know, is for everybody. Nowadays, of course, people can exercise that right to impart, express content in a way that is public. Previously, of course, it was only those who owned or had access to media enterprises who could do that, to the old media. Now, what this means, in a sense, is that anybody who is looking to publish information to a public needs not just freedom of expression, they need press freedom. In other words, they need to be able the freedom to go wider than just talking in a restaurant or in a family or in the street, in a classroom. If they are reaching a public, everybody needs this press freedom. So media freedom, press freedom, it's not about the media as institutions. It's about the ability for anybody to use institutions to reach the public.
Okay, got it.
Now, what we saw, as you said, with the Arab Spring, is that this new freedom, which ultimately has been whittled back, but it gave voice to people, voice to everybody. And we have seen over the years that voice is one thing, but there are also different voices. So democracy is part of giving everybody a voice, but some of the voices have been used against democracy. That's clear. Disinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories, and so on. In this equation, though, of giving voice, it's clear that democracy is not enough to have voice. You also need rational debate and you need reliable information. And so this is why press freedom is particularly important for those who are in that business. Now, not all journalists, not all media are in the business of doing journalism. Some are doing propaganda, some are in the business of sensationalism. But on the whole, the norms and the ideals of journalists are to produce verified information and comment and analysis in the public interest. So it's a higher standard than freedom of expression, a voluntary standard that they set. If you want to claim to be a journalist, you should not be involved in gossip. You should not be involved in circulating misinformation, disinformation. You should be living up to these standards. And when you do that, you need press freedom, particularly because that makes you more susceptible to attack. If I'm an ordinary person using freedom of expression and then press freedom to put out some kind of news about what I had for lunch to the public, nobody really cares in power. Yes. But if you're a journalist, you use the same freedom, but what you put out is inconvenient to some people, and they jump on you. So sometimes they jump on everybody's voice, but particularly there's jumping on journalists' output, which is not just voice. It's a particular kind of voice. It's not personal voice. It's guided by certain codes of conduct and standards, and they are judged by their colleagues and by the public as to whether they live up to them.
Got that. Now, we're now talking in the context of the Institute for Accountability in a Digital Age. What do you see as the current challenges, the biggest challenges you have with UNESCO, with preserving press freedom? How is digital influencing that desire?
Right. So in this particular repression of journalistic expression that we see, and we have seen, for many, many decades, my own history, of course, and of course, not just the imparting of information, but the access to information as well. What we've seen is many people in power, not only governments, but political people in particular, they say journalists must be responsible. Mm-hmm. Now, the word responsible is vague. And what it really means is you must be responsible to our definition of what you should be doing. At UNESCO, we prefer the word accountable, because when you use the word accountable, you talk more about accountable to what and to whom.
Yes.
And in the case of journalistic expression, you're accountable to particular standards, which are laid out in codes of conduct of journalism. And to whom are you accountable? You're accountable not to governments, but you're accountable to the public and the public interest. And therefore, in journalism, best practice is self-regulation, that you have peer review like press councils that will assess whether you have exceeded ethical standards, that will give an opportunity to the public to give you redress. So that's what we are promoting at UNESCO, accountability like that. Now, of course, everybody is accountable to obey the laws and human rights standards and so on. Not everybody does, but everybody is equally accountable. But to do journalism, you should have a very particular, specialized kind of accountability for that sort of expression. What happens then with the internet and these intermediaries who, this is what your institute is looking at. What is their obligation in terms of accountability? And indeed, as you know, there's a whole discourse about responsible AI. Again, we have issues. We have to think, this word responsible, does it really give much help, or would it be better to say accountable AI? I can come back to that, but to focus on the internet companies, these intermediaries, which don't just, as everybody knows, they don't just mediate communications, they also have their own interests and their own technologies and algorithms and so on, which are ways in which the content is curated and moderated.
Yeah, I do have to point out that when we look at accountability, we look at all stakeholders involved who have a role to play in a context of accountability. So it's not just one stakeholder. I do have to make that clear from our perspective.
Sure. Absolutely. So, I've spoken about those doing journalism and their accountability, and then you have each individual user who is also being used by the platforms that they use. Everybody has accountability, governments, users, but the particular accountability of companies becomes very important because they are the gatekeepers, the main gatekeepers of journalism, but also of other expression. And so what is the model that would be preferable for that kind of accountability? The distinctive, because as I said, everybody's accountable to the law. Mm-hmm. But do you have particular accountabilities in terms of being an institution that is a gatekeeper for communications, whether you're a search engine, whether you're a social media platform, whether you're an encrypted social messaging platform? What is your accountability? So I certainly think that UNESCO would agree with everybody being accountable, but what is the specificity of these companies? This is the big debate, of course, at the moment. So I can elaborate a little bit more on UNESCO's point here, but perhaps you want to.
Okay. The big debate you actually just referred to, is that a warm debate or is that a harsh debate today?
I'm not quite sure that distinction you're making. Just tell me a bit more.
Well, I know UNESCO is also setting up frameworks to allow us to have a debate on a global level by proposing the Rome Principles to have a debate on a global level, the rights-based, open, accessible, and multi-stakeholder participation. So we want to have a debate on that basis. So I was just wondering, because you mentioned, okay, that this is a great debate. Do you find that people do find each other and are willing to collaborate and come to terms and look at solutions, or do you feel that debate in itself is a struggle?
Well, it's always about power and about money and culture and everything else. So it's always a debate but I think this is why it's important, this model that you mentioned, ROAM, which was agreed by the 193 member states of UNESCO. So it should carry some status because of that. This model, the ROAM, rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholder. The key part there is the multi-stakeholder, because although it's not so fashionable anymore, basically, if you want to reach some kind of governance of rights, you want to keep the internet relatively open, so it's not a monopolized space or closed space. You want to promote accessibility, including the competencies that people need to critically use digital technologies, connected technologies. You need this multi-stakeholder governance. Now, there's, as everybody knows who's listening to this discussion, I'm sure, governance covers many issues, from norms down to regulations. And multi-stakeholderism in the UNESCO perspective is relevant to all of these. Of course, at the end, some people will have to take decisions and responsibility for the areas under their domain, their control. They have authority over a certain area, they have the responsibility and the accountability for that. But that doesn't mean unilateral decision-making. It doesn't mean unilateral power. It doesn't mean unilateral policy formulation, nor does it mean unilateral evaluation of performance. And the only way to really try and prevent internet from being captured by a government or by a security ministry in the government, as opposed to a commerce ministry, or stop it being captured, one space being captured by one company, search or social media. The only way to do that is to really push this multi-stakeholder thing, particularly with civil society, academia, because these bring different perspectives. And actually, they can bring rights-based perspectives. Not to say that they are sort of neutral, but certainly governments have their interests, we know that. Companies, of course, have their interests, we know that. But the idea of this is to really mean that, to try and keep out of the space of capture, so that it can be something that is representing an aggregation of interests on the whole. Now, to whom then is the accountability? That depends. Facebook have set up their accountability for content takedowns to an outsourced body. Mm-hmm. Well, what about other areas of their operations? Where's their accountability there? Obviously, some is to states. That's changing. There's questions about their behavior in competition policy, and they'll have to account there. There may be other things where, for example, privacy, they may have to count differently there. So it becomes a complex thing, but in all these areas, if there's going to be competition policy and accountability, it should be subject to multi-stakeholder participation. If there's going to be privacy, it should be subject to multi-stakeholder participation. So this is really where I think UNESCO is coming from, because if you want the rights, you want the openness, and you want the access, you have to have these inputs.
Yeah, right, got that. Okay, hey, one last question before I let you go, Guy. You once stated, if you have freedom but not a strong basis for journalism, it's like having a half-empty freedom. Is the current digital technology a strong basis for journalism?
It's mixed. On the one hand, it gives citizen journalists, academics doing journalism, institutes doing journalism, and the media, it gives them a lot more outreach. The platforms are much bigger, and often they can escape direct controls. Now, sometimes those controls are legitimate, like defamation, but often they don't meet international standards. So very good from that point of view. But of course, it all takes money to produce journalism. And there, the internet has been very bad for the media. As everybody knows, the media lost the competition for advertising, partially because the media are not in the data gathering business in the way that big tech companies are. And so what we're seeing today is a real problem. Media houses are cutting back. Many are closing, particularly in developing countries, or they are being captured by those who want to own them for political reasons.
Okay.
or use government advertising. But so this is the thing. Just as journalism becomes even more important when an environment of misinformation and disinformation, the ability to produce it is being constrained. And there we do need policy, multi-stakeholder policy, about how to finance journalism in a way that keeps it independent and able to account to its standards, not to whoever's going to be giving the money.
Okay, so that's going to be the next quest. Make certain we get sufficient funding, that we still have that strong independent journalism and freedom of journalism. Yeah, that we keep that. Okay, it's a very important and relevant quest. So Guy, I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and you can say how UNESCO is approaching this. So yeah, I want to thank you for your time and sharing that with us so much.
Thank you. It was good to exchange with you, and I wish the Institute all the best in the important debates that you are hosting.